Hello and welcome to this webinar on the latest functionality contained within STRUMIS Evolution version 10.4. In this webinar, we're going to be covering a great number of enhancements across the wider system. They're not going to be specific to one module. We're going to be looking at various modules and a workflow as well. If any of you have got any questions at all throughout the course of this webinar, please feel free to drop them in the chat window at the side, and we'll be reviewing those at the end of the webinar in a Q&A session with Chris Eaton. First, we'd like to show you some of the system and configuration enhancements we've made to STRUMIS before moving on to the contract workflow, where we can see some of the other new functionality in action. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the item library. So we're going to go to Items and Inventory in the bottom corner down here, go up the left and access our item library. Now you notice when I opened that up, in previous versions of the software we had a situation where this would load the item library straight away. So for those of us that have large item libraries, that could have taken a reasonable amount of time to return the results back to grid. Now we have a situation where we would have to hit search to return the results back to the grid. So that's going to allow us the opportunity to pre-filter before accessing the grid to get results back. So I'm just going to make sure I'm accessing my plate records. And I'm going to do a grade A36. You may notice this is a US database. And if I hit search, that's then going to return the results quickly back to my grid. That's going to bring me to my next point, where we have tracking type now as a column visible within the item library. So when we're determining precisely what tracking level we've got our items in the library set as, we can see that directly on the grid now without us having to access the record to get in there and take a look. So normally we would have to come in here and then go to item properties and then take a look at what the inventory tracking type is. As I say, now we can see that directly on the grid. Now, as well as being able to see it here in the item library, we also have that level now available to us in inventory. So when we're determining what level of, you can see here it's just positioned there. I'm just going to hit search and return my results back to my grid. We can now filter for our tracking levels within the inventory module as well. Now that's going to give us the opportunity to see what the expected return in terms of tracking level is in our inventory, and this will act as a visual verification to make sure that our steel and non-steel items are being tracked under the correct category. So the next new piece of functionality that we have available to us is to designate area as a valid unit of measure to determine scrap. So we can see here it's on the grid as well. We can see scrap type there. And so things like plates where, let's say we've got a skeleton return from a nest, we've got the remaining steels left behind. In the old way of handling things, we would have to do that determined based on length, which wouldn't give us an accurate feed on whether we had any usable material left behind or not. So now that we have area as a unit of measure, we can now specify the meters squared of the steel remaining to determine whether it's something we'd like to keep or not. So in order to set up area as a scrap type, we can do that from the section type in here. So if I open up plates down here, so for nonlinear sections, we could utilize area as that option. Now we also have, you can see here, length used to be the way we'd handle that. We could still leave linear sections, such as our channels, as a length scrap type. And if I wanted to update that in the item library, if I was to double click on that, I would have to go into item properties, and we can see here meter squared. 2 meters is the scrap value that we'd be looking to get rid of. If I was to update multiple records with that, so let's say I wanted to take all the plates that I have at an A36 grade, I could go to Actions and Batch Update, and we can see that Scrap in 10.4 is now its own tab. So we can tick the box for Update Scrap Area and modify the minimum scrap value that we want to put in there. So the next new piece of functionality we have in the item area of the system is within the section type. Now before, whenever we were working with the angle nesting engine, we were in a situation where if we had a non-symmetrical shape, we couldn't utilize it with angle nesting. Now, if I pick something like this channel at the top here, you can see here it's got a U profile on DSTV. We now have the opportunity to tick the box for can rotate for angle bevel nesting. So unlike in previous versions of the software, where if we came across channels, which is the example I've chosen here, or other non-symmetricals, we'd have ended up in a scenario where toes up and toes down would have been meeting during the rotation of putting the angles into one another. So now that we are limiting the axis of rotation for these sections, utilizing them with the angle nesting engine is now possible. So another piece of non-contract specific functionality that we see as a new improvement in 10.4, under document management, if we were to have a look under our document search grid, like we saw with items in inventory, we're now in a situation whereby we can pre-filter before documents are pulled into this search. So I clicked on document up here, and rather than the list of documents already being pre-populated, I'm now in a position where I can utilize my filters across the top to find specifics relating to the documents I want to review. Now, this is of course only applicable if we don't use the document management button up here, which already has a pre-filter to show us contract specific documents. So that's going to work for us if we go to the left hand side here to document. So it might be that I'm looking for, under my details, I might be looking for a document type of fittings. And if I do a quick search for them, we can see here that it's pulled all of my fitting-based documents through. Now this all ties into some major speed improvements that we've made throughout the software as well, and that's applicable to multiple areas throughout STRUMIS. So the final piece of new functionality outside of my contract progression I'd just like to mention before we move on is going to be under purchasing and suppliers and the supplier search grid. So previously in the software, if we wanted to change something across multiple records, say for example we want to update the tax code for multiple suppliers, I would have to go into each of the records, change that tax code, save it, close it, move on to the next one, change it, save it, close it, and so on and so on. Now, as a massive time save, we can have multiple records selected, go down here to Actions and Batch Update, and we can make various changes to multiple records at the same time. So if we wanted to change the tax code, I could just go down here, pick an alternative tax code, and then hit Batch Update. And of course, relative to those, we also have Clear as an option to the side as well if we want to remove those types, those changes from these records. So there is one final piece of new information I'd like to have a look at before we leave the supplier records. If I open up a supplier and take a look at the EDI tab, we can see that we have a new format for our EDI transactions. We can now utilize transaction interfaces within STRUMIS in 10.4, which can operate with file types such as the AISC neutral steel XML format. So if I activate my transaction interfaces, what that's going to do is enable me to have an export and import interface available for EDI within STRUMIS. So what that's going to let me do is export in a way in which our supplier can read the EDI data, but then have a conversion done on the way back into STRUMIS when it's sent back to us so that we can receive it in a format that we require. So those can be configured by creating some new transaction interfaces and then selecting them from the drop-down menus. Okay, so let's move on. So let's go ahead and build our new contract. I'm going to do that from my shortcut up here on my contract ribbon. And contained within our contract, we have our execution class. Now, we now have a new piece of functionality within 10.4 where we can default our execution class from a contracts management option. And the way we're going to access that is by coming down here to contracts management and going into contracts management options. If we scroll our way down here, we can see there is a field there for default contract execution class. So if we were a company working predominantly with execution class 3 type jobs, we can specify that at the position here and save that. So now next time I create a new contract, it'll automatically add it as 3. So let's close this one down and create a new contract to see the default come into play. So we can see the execution class is coming through as 3 now. So I'm going to give it a description. So this is an office block we're going to be working on. And I'm going to put that into my office project. Now we're going to be using a CAD sourcing for phase, lot, and unique ID to connect those properties in the model during the import. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to connect this up to my inquiry for this job. And I'm going to save it. So I'm going to display my contract in my contract ribbon, as I'm going to use that for the progression of the job. A quick mention of a couple of other things in the contract. So I've just put the basic information here in details. However, if I was to come across here to my key requirements tab, which is also new for 10.4 within the contract, we can see the layout is completely new for 10.4 and it's pulling through my defaults that I've specified from my ellipsis buttons to the right hand side here. So I've got defaults on all of these. And if I wanted to, as I've connected my inquiry to the contract, I could have come down here to copy and copied the details from the inquiry itself. So if I'd have made any specific changes, then they would have been brought through into the contract as well. Now, if I go over to my invoicing tab, this is also brand new for 10.4, and we've already done a webinar on this, so you're more than welcome to go and find that, along with the rest of the videos that are all hosted on our YouTube channel. One thing I am going to do before I go any further with this is I'm going to specify my default retention. I'm going to place that in at 5%, specify the due date for this. Let's make it a year from now. And let's specify our completion date as, let's put it in for November. And I'm going to bring through my milestones from my estimate that's already found as I've connected it into the contract via the inquiry. So I'm going to grab all of my subsections and add those in. So that's now ready for me to start work when I want to come back and start doing some progress billing a little bit later on in the job. And as we draw value through our contract, through our progress billing and invoicing modules, we'll start to see that information coming through on our contract search grid. So this has been overhauled for 10.4 as well, now showing the details pertinent to the way in which we're handling our transactions through our progress billing and invoicing module, to show details such as our scheduled invoices. We've got the retention data coming through here as well. And now I've highlighted up grand total invoices so that we can take a look at another new function that we have in the system. In grid options and show hide columns, we now have this new column for decimal places. And if we scroll down and have a quick look at our grand total invoices column, you can see here I've got it separated for 2 decimal places. Now, if I wanted to, I could take all decimal places out, put that down to 0. You can see here it switches at the back. So we really have got some flexibility about how many decimal places that we put in through the system. Now this is going to come in handy for any financial fields we may find. It might also come in handy for any lengths fields we may find through the system, particularly in detailed listing and through to nesting. We might want to see some rounding taking place in those areas. So if I close that off, we also have another new function to do with the way that we're displaying value. If we go up to home, we can see here we've got a new thousandth separator option available to us in the units. Now, if I disable that, you can see the thousandth separator disappears from our fields. Now, that again comes in handy when we're looking at financial values or anything over the 1,000 mark, and really is a visual change. It doesn't affect any of the values in the system, just like the way in which we handle our metric or imperial swap, or changing over the display weights from metric tons to short tons, which we can do fairly easily as well. And as I say, it's a visual change. So my next step with my contract in place, I'm now going to close everything down, go back to my contract ribbon, and I'm going to go to my wizards and import my prelim listing. So I'm going to go next here in the wizard. It's already selected my contract to import into. I'm going to go next, and I'm going to pick my CAD interface. Now you may notice I have only a singular CAD interface selected. Before I progress the wizard any further, I'm just going to explain how that's come to be. If I cancel that down, go to System and CAD Interfaces, we've ended up with a singular interface for prelim as a result of using our new option in this grid to batch update whether the interface is active or not. Now, by deactivating a CAD interface, it disappears from the search grid. It doesn't lose itself from the system, so you can re-enable it at any time simply by ticking the box that says active. Now, if you had to do that for a great number of interfaces or any more than one, it would involve you opening each of these records, hitting that box, saving it, moving on to the next one. So to reduce down time it takes to do that, we've incorporated now a batch update where you can go actions, batch update. As I say, you can simply enable or disable these from the wizards at will. So I'm going to go back to that wizard again, and we'll go back to the prelim import. I'm going to go next. As I say, contract selected. I'm going to pick my interface. So I'm going to use the ellipsis button to pick my import file. I'm going to hit open. And with that selected, I can hit next to load the file into the system. So now the CAD interface has pulled my file in. I can see that the majority of my steels have already been cross-referenced. You can see the references already pulling through from the item library. However, I do have 84 unrecognized marks, so STRUMIS hasn't recognized the naming convention utilized on these plates. Now, if I use the source item cross-reference filter, I can see there that I'm going to have 3 different widths on a 3/4 plate at A36. So if I was using a previous version of the software, I would have to, for each of those different widths, put in a cross-reference for plate 3/4 A36, which means I'd have to enter that 3 times. Now we have an opportunity to, if I select all of those, utilize under actions an import as item function. Now, what this is going to do is similar to the way that we would handle putting in a cross-reference inside the import as item. We can now specify for all of these in one go what they're actually going to be imported as. So I'm going to put them in here as plates 3/4 at A36, and if I hit OK, that's then put the cross-reference in for every single one of those items in one go. So if I revalidate marks, you can see there it's cleared them and dropped them into valid marks. So now I can finish the import by going next, and I'm going to remove the attachment and hit finish. So now that I've persisted cross-references as well during that import, next time I import a 3/4 plate with those descriptions, it'll know that I need them at that section size. So that's our prelim list created, and we can see everything is in the edit state currently. We can also see here, new to 10.4, the alternate name field is coming through in our prelim, and we'll see that a little bit later on in detailed as well. So what I'd like to do at a point of approved for nesting and ordering, we're going to be looking for our W sections in phase 1 and list 1.3. So I'm going to put some filters in place at the top. So I'm going to go phase 1, list 1.3, and it's going to be our beams. I can filter here on code for W sections. So what we're going to do is first of all set these to released, and then they'll be ready, prepared for nesting and ordering. So I've got them set in released. So now we're going to nest all of these. So I'm going to grab all of them, just go to nesting and ordering, auto cut selection. And I'm going to be using free inventory to start with. And I'm going to go next. And we can see our W sections 24 by 55 at grade of A992. We've got 3 lengths at 30 foot in our inventory. So if we go next, we're going to see how our sections nest into the available lengths. Okay, it looks like we've covered 6 of them, but we've got several lengths that haven't been covered. So what we're going to do is take a quick look at what's nested in. So if we just do a quick expand all here, that's going to open up our cut plans and we can see what's been nested in. So we've got on our first length, we've got 2 pieces in there, and we've got 2 rounds of the next length. We've got the same nest duplicated twice here on 2 lengths. So if I go next and commit that nest and allocate it, I'm going to go next and finish. We can see there now they've jumped to the covered tab. And we can see here that we've covered off a quantity from each line. However, if we go to part covered, we can still see that we have an outstanding quantity of 8. Now I'm just going to switch on my batch column. Just make sure I can see that. Let's bring that into view. So we can see that that's also associated with the batch that we've just run. Now we have an option visually to see whether we have a part covered tab, or we can switch that off if we go to production options and we have a look for this option here to split part covered prelim marks and mark items into covered and not covered. So if we save that, it'll split the line automatically for us. If I close that down and go to prelim, if I go here now, you can see there's no part covered tab. I can see in the release tab, we can now split this so that we've got it set here. You can see the outstanding quantity is 8 here, and that would then be re-nested at this time. I'm going to complete this process utilizing part covered, so I'm going to go back and switch that option back off again, bring my part covered tab back in, shut that down and reopen it. That's now brought my part covered in. So what I'm going to do is change the status back to edit, and I'm going to go back into the edit section, and I'm going to clear that batch out, and then what I'm going to do is then run that through with the rest of the steels in my W sections that are in the released section. You can see there now that line's now come through and we've got nothing in part covered. I'm going to take all of those and I'm going to nest these together into a different batch. So I'm going to go nesting and ordering, auto cut selection, and I'm going to create a new batch for them. And this time I'm going to use my suppliers and I'm going to use mill standard lengths. So just to make sure I've got my auto cut settings set correctly, I'm going to restore my server defaults, make sure I've got some mill sizes in. I do, there's increments available. So I'm going to save that. And I'm going to go next and process that nest. So we can see here that our mill lengths have successfully covered the required steels. And if I do a quick expand all again on those lengths, we can see what's been covered inside each of those nests. So our cut plans fully expanded are showing us what steel has been nested and to what lengths they've been nested into from the mill. Now I want to have a look at some new functionality surrounding roll references on the next page. So if I click on roll references and use the drop down on roll reference, we can see that I've got all of the roll references available to be selected from. In previous versions of the software, we could either only select our next available roll reference or the next available with capacity. Now we're in a situation where in 10.4 any valid roll reference can be selected, not just the current or the next one. So I'm going to pick this one here and I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to specify a new purchase order. You can see there's some existing for this particular supplier outstanding at the minute. So I can go next and I'm going to go finish. I'm not going to auto release this purchase order because there's some new functionality I'd like to have a look at inside the PO itself. So I'm going to open up that purchase order and I'm going to go to the Lines tab. So within purchase orders, there are a series of new enhancements to 10.4 we can take a look at now. First one being, if we wanted to modify the price on a line, there were two ways to do it in the older versions of the system. Either we double click and open up a line and then modify the price and the price unit, or alternatively, if we wanted to apply a price to multiple lines, we would go down here to Actions and go to Batch Update. We could then go to our Pricing Informations tab, go to Update Pricing Information and put in our price and our unit. Now we have the opportunity to tick a box at the bottom that says Apply Item Supplier Pricing. So in 10.4, what we can do is look back to the values that have been attributed to the items by supplier in the item library, or specifically contract-specific prices, and update the lines utilizing that data. So all we have to do is tick that box and hit Batch Update to apply that information. Now I'd already used the supplier values at the point of concluding my nest, so that value is already in place, but that would be the process that we would do to trigger that logic. If I put them in individual instance mode, it's broken my lines out, so I had a quantity of 2 on my top line. That's now broken it into 2 lines. Now in previous versions of the software, we weren't able to transfer lines on individual instance over to another purchase order. Now, if I was to right click, we have an option here to transfer selected lines to another PO. So I could move that to a different purchase order for either the same or different supplier. And of course, if I use the ellipsis button here, I could create a brand new purchase order to move that onto. We also have a new option in terms of how we handle documentation and NC files at this level. If I was to come down here to Actions, if I wanted to send over the documentation and NC data that's associated with the parts within my purchase order, I could come down here to Email Documents with Purchase Order. Now at this moment, we're working on with a prelim nest, so there isn't any NC or documentation associated with these particular parts at the moment, but we'll get round to doing that when we get to the detailed nesting side of things. So let's go ahead and move on from this contract to my other contract for the remainder of the processes we're going to take a look at. So first thing I'm going to do is close all on these, and I'm going to swap to my other contract. Now this contract has already had a detailed listing imported. It's already been lotted and released. It's been nested. Material has been purchased and received, and we can see that we've had work orders generated, and we do have a number of cut mark items in production as well. Now that information is crucial to the way in which we're going to handle the next stage of our functionality review, where we'll be doing a revision on our detailed listing import. So let's go to Wizards and import detailed listing. And let's follow the wizard through. So let's go next, make sure it's on our contract, which it is, go next. And again, we've limited the interfaces down at the detailed listing level to just our singular one, utilizing the new functionality we saw in the CAD interface active box switch with a batch update. So we're going to pick our revision file and we're going to push that into the system. So we can see that we have all mark items valid. We've got no cross-referencing to do. We can see that it's phased and lotted. So we're going to move on to our next screen where we're going to review the revisions properties. So looking at the revision screen, we can see that we have a great number of unchanged mark items. However, we have 24 new mark items, 87 changed, and 3 removed. Now, to understand what we're looking at here, we first need to understand the nature of the revision that we're going through. So the process we're embarking on right now is the changeover of 3 columns and their associated base plates for a shorter column across the board, across all 3, and we're also exchanging the material on the base plates from 3/4 inch plate to 1 inch plate. So what we're looking at here is the result of that change. So let's explore a little bit more about what's going on. So in the remove mark items, we can see that the 3/4 inch plate is being removed from the listing. So what that's going to do there is, by utilizing our new revisions functionality on the next screen, where we're going to be cancelling those, we're going to be black flagging those 3/4 inch plates in the detailed listing. So they're going to be removed, which means that in our new mark items, we should see, if I just set up a quick sort by revision detail, we have new mark items. Our 1 inch plate is being created there for them. So that's what's happening with our plate changeover. Now, to understand what's happening with the size change on our columns, we can see here again, if I just do a quick revision detail sort, our W section columns at the top there, we can see that we've got a change as opposed to a removal and new, so they should simply just reduce down in size. However, notice here that we've got can revise, new and changed. There's no ability to revise those as it currently stands, as they've been production cut. So what we're going to do is we're going to be bringing those back and reutilizing the material to nest them again. So because it's a reduction in size, we can simply renest the material that we used in the first place. So we're going to be looking at that over the next stage of the revisions process. We're expecting an unnest needed for these. So we can also see that we've got a marked quantity decrease across our C1015s, and in our new, we've got a C1051. So what that's doing is that's basically taking almost a replica of the C1015 to create the C1051, and it's remarking it. And that's attributed to the changes in the model as well. So if we wanted to see that in the model view itself, I'm just going to do a quick flip on there. So let's take a look at our columns that are being affected by the length change. I'm going to go to Actions, BIM Review. So I can see it's these 3 columns from the model that are being affected by the length change. So these are the ones that we're going to be taking a look at in a moment within the nesting screens. As we can see, as I mentioned previously, we can't revise them, so we're going to have to make some changes there, as well as with the removed mark items, they're going to become part of our unnest as well. So if we first draw our attentions to the received and cut columns, I'm just going to collapse everything before we do anything else. We can see that all the plates and our W sections are all received, so materials in, and it has been cut as well. So what we're going to be looking to do here is we're looking to reclaim our material to utilize it for a secondary nest where possible, to reuse that material as appropriately as possible. If I just expand all those out again, that's obvious when we look down to our W sections. Our C1029, it has been received and cut, that bar has, so we need to make sure we're reclaiming that back in, so that as the length has decreased on our mark items that we're going to use for those columns, we can use that material to be nested back into to then shave down the difference on the bar to make sure that we've got the appropriate size part following our revision. As for things like our base plates, where we've got our BP 1002, now that material has been cut. However, I could leave that where it is and orphan the material and leave it in the process, so that I've got my new plates coming through that need to be nested and created out of different material. So however, I'm just going to unnest all of them in one go. So everything that I have set up on the nesting engine to run to and unnest, I'm going to just have that as STRUMIS recommends. And the ability to unnest things in the condition we find them in this contract, where we have things in production, is something that's new to 10.4, as well as we've relaxed some of the more stringent rules that we had in previous versions of the software. So I'm going to make sure that I'm returning any cut piece and the remaining of the bar into inventory individually. That's going to make sure that I have those cut components back in my inventory to nest to a second time. And on the screen, we need to make sure we're utilizing our cancel, remove marks and mark items, whereas in a previous webinar that we looked at on the enhancements and revision changes for 10.4, which again we can find on YouTube. In this scenario, I do have the requirement for this, as I have those three base plates that are now no longer required. So I need to make sure that they're going to be black flagged in my listing and throughout my contract, so that they are cancelled off, and I can then progress on the 1-inch plate through in its place. So if I go to finish now, you can see that it's doing the unnest. So we now have the relative changes thanks to the revision of our detailed listing. So let's take a quick look at how some of those have impacted the listing. So first of all, let's take a look at C1029. We know we had a modification there. So if I open that up, and I'm just going to stick on my individual mark item instances and display cancelled as well when I access this. So we can see here that we have had a length change to our main member W section. That's now shorter than it was originally. And we can see here that the 3/4 inch plate has been cancelled, and we have our new 1-inch plate in place. We also know that there was a new column brought in on C1015. And if we take a look here, we can see if I deactivate my cancelled mark instances, there's our 4 current new items, new columns. And if I turn on my cancelled mark item instances, you can see that there's the cancelled column, and all the relative component mark items are also cancelled on it. You also notice that alternate name is also being brought through the detailed listing now in 10.4. So that's a new feature for us in the detailed listing as well. So let's move on to the next step, and let's go into production lotting. So the first thing I'd like to point out in production lotting is, as we've seen in our previous webinar, again also available on YouTube, on drawing control, we have the ability to directly send transmittals and RFIs from within the lotting module and further modules on through the system, and that's resulted in our transmittals being generated. They're listed in the new columns that we see inside lotting as well, along with other drawing based columns that we have in place, such as revisions and approval dates, and that's resulted in as well the population of transmittals and RFIs for this contract, which we can now see as new icons up here on our contract ribbon. And we also have on our contract ribbon the new application for payment icon as well. We also have within lotting our new display individual mark instances and display cancelled mark instances, which will become useful to us a little bit later on in this process. In the lotted tab, the aim here that I'm looking to achieve is I would like to release, to continue on my process, my C1051 associated W sections. So what I'm going to do is use the new 10.4 release name functionality, and I'm going to place it into my Rev1 release name and hit OK. So that's now placed that into released. So what I'm going to do now is go into my nesting and ordering module to nest up my changed W sections. So now the shorter ones will be nested into the lengths we had remaining from the unnest of their original longer lengths. So I'm going to go into not covered, and I'm going to take a look for my W sections. And I can see here I've got these 26'11" lengths. So they're the new shorter lengths. They're missing the additional quarter. So I'm going to grab all of those, go nesting and ordering, auto cut selection. And I'm going to put those into a new batch. So we're going to utilize the name from the first one. And we're going to put in there length rev. Now I'm going to use my allocated to this contract material. I'm not going to be using suppliers or any of my free inventories or theoreticals. And I'm just going to run that through by hitting next. And we can see here it's picking up the original length materials that we had in already, that we've now got sat in inventory. And if I go next, we can see there it's nesting them out of the original length bar that we had in for them. So I can simply go next and have them allocated from inventory and finish. And that's now placed those shorter lengths onto the material that we had from the unnesting of the longer length that it was originally prior to the revision. So as I also have another function to look at in lotting, we're going to go back here for a moment. I'm going to clear my filters out, and I'm going to filter for my SS columns. Now these have been approved for nesting and ordering, so I'm going to push these through a release as well. So what I'm going to do before I do that is take a look at another new piece of functionality surrounding the way in which we can handle the description of marks. So anywhere that we can get at the batch update contract mark, we now have the ability to batch update the marks description. So I'm going to create a new description for these, or rather I'm going to use my column description. I can see it's already one available for me. So I'm going to rename these column. I'm going to hit batch update. We should see they're now specified as column, which we can see there. Now I'm going to release these into nesting and ordering in the same process as I did before. I'm going to create a new batch for these. These are columns for phase 2. So they're now released for nesting and ordering. And I'm going to filter for my new release name, my phase 2 columns, and sort for my W sections. So in a moment, we're going to go through the RFQ process with those and continue them through the system. But for now, just before we do that, I'd just like to point out some new functionality in terms of the grids that we have in 10.4. We now have the ability to see the start and end web angle, as we have in the detailed listing. We also have in 10.4 some of our DSTV information being published directly onto the grids as well. That's pertinent to the angles for the top and bottom flanges, as well as the hole diameters in those faces as well. Now that's going to be useful to us if we are looking to utilize batch processing of CAM, and if we're nesting in relation to our workstations, we can quickly identify if there are any parts that won't be able to be processed through those workstations from this information. So I'm going to go scroll back across, and let's push these through the RFQ process in the nesting engine. So we're going to go nesting and ordering, auto cut selection. And I'm going to put them into a new batch. So phase 2 columns. Let's follow the naming convention. And we're going to be using supplier lengths for this. So if I go next, I'd also like to point out before we continue this nest that as well in 10.4 we also now have the opportunity to do welded bars with plate sections. So anyone who's working with plate girders, which at the moment this isn't incorporated into this particular job, that's also incorporated now in 10.4. So we can see on this particular nest we're sourcing our material from our generic nesting supplier to start with. So I'm just going to follow this through and let the nesting engine decide on the best potential lengths for these parts. And that's fully covered them to the available lengths. We can see our cut plans below. It seems to have nested most of them single part to a bar. And if I go next and do save RFQ and set up to send the RFQ to the generic nesting supplier, that means it's open for me to send it to multiple suppliers. I'm just going to give this a name. So phase 2 columns, and I'm going to finish that process. Now that's now put that onto a saved nest for me to come back at a later date once I've received the available lengths from my suppliers. So I can see that my RFQ document has been generated, so I can then send that off to a variety of different suppliers, get my rates and availabilities back, and when that returns back to me, I can then go back into the saved nest to update the rates that I've received and identify who I'll be purchasing those pieces of steel from, whether it be the same supplier or various. So I can retrieve my saved nest, at which point we can utilize part of our new functionality in 10.4, which we saw as well at the purchase order level. It's the same sort of approach that we have here, where I can pick a supplier and use the item supplier pricing. Now, as I mentioned before, what that's going to allow me to do is if I have contract specific pricing, it'll pick that, and if there's no contract specific pricing in place against that supplier, against the steel in the item library, it will then choose the default supplier rate that we have in place. So I'm going to utilize that and hit batch update, and we can see there it's applied 60 cents a pound to those items in there. So I'm now going to progress that through and then push this to a new purchase order for Metals USA. So that's now created me my new purchase order. And at this time, if I wanted to send off my NCs and drawings, I could then come down here to email documents with the purchase order, and I could include CAM and NC files, or just the drawings, or throw both at that. So I'm going to put both of those onto that. So this means, as well as being able to send over the report itself for the purchase order, I can also now send this zipped file alongside it without having to leave and find the documentation and the CAM data and attach that to the email separately. I can now simply just apply it directly from STRUMIS as this zip file, and we can see in here I've got NCs and DXF drawings as well. So I can simply just punch in the details for the supplier and then send that off. And of course, as we're loading it as an email, we've got all the capability there to add in some content, some body into that, and as well add our standard signatures into place too. So we can personalize it before sending it. So next I'm going to, a little way down the line, receive this. So I need to make sure that I've got it set in release to begin with, and I'm going to receive this purchase order. And it's in the purchase order receipt that we're going to talk about a couple new pieces of functionality for 10.4 as well. So first of all, let's go ahead and just put in our delivery note number. And then we can look down here After saving, I'm going to enable individual instances, and it's with instance mode enabled, we can see our cut plan column populating. Now this is new for 10.4, and with that in relation to our allocations column that we can see here as well, we would be able to use the cut plan column to make sure that we're receiving the correct bars for the correct cut plans at the point when they're going through each machine, which is really going to reduce down the amount of time it takes us utilizing other functionalities such as swap bar, where we have to exchange bars one for another so that we've got the correct one being used at the correct cut plan. So I'm going to add some cast references in here. And also throughout the course of receipting this material, I'm going to state that I need to do a quality inspection on this line here, as it may very well have been damaged at the point of receipt. Now I'm doing that to have a look at some new functionality in purchase order returns in a moment, but it shows that we've got the classification variable in there as well that allows me to indicate if a bar is non-usable. So if I save that, now before I continue, I could always come down here to go to actions and print the item inventory barcode label report off. Now we've had some further enhancements within that report for 10.4 in relation to the developments that we've made on the swap bar functionality within the STRUMIS mobility app. We also have within 10.4 a notes field available to us up here on our PO receipts in 10.4 as well now. So if I save that and complete it, I'm going to receipt my material into stock. And it's from here I'm going to then go to the purchasing and supplier module and have a look at purchase order returns. So I'm going to go create a new one. Indicate my supplier. And the reason, damaged bar. So it's from there I can put in my supplier reference, and I can then save this record ready to drop in the lines from my receipts. So unlike in previous versions of the system, we are now able to return nested material and also anything that's been specified as non-usable. So in this case, I can then do a quick search here on my yard references for my quality inspection. And we can see there's our line that's currently specified as classification of damaged. So I can simply add that on to this return, where I could then save and complete that return. So I can then print off my returns report that can go with the damaged steel back to the supplier on its shipment. So let's go ahead and close everything down. Let's shut all of our windows. Let's do close all. And let's go and take a look in generate contract work orders. So first piece of new development we have in here is the ability to see our individual marker mark item instances coupled with display cancelled marker mark item instances. So like we had in lotting, we can see these filters are here, and we'll also see those over in production control as well. So if I enable that function, if I go to my marks issued, we can see here I've got a black flagged line visible in my grid view. Now, if I just disable those for a second. So if I take a look at my issued mark items, we can also see here, it's visible on both the not issued and issued mark items. We can see our release name and release date is visible in the grids here. It's also visible in the marks as well. And we also have now the cut type column exposed in our grids for our mark items too. So if I have a look at the mark items issued, you can see I've got profile cut as well as straight cut in that grid view. Now this is also useful because we've now exposed this as a rule when generating work orders as well. So that can now be incorporated into production templates. So you can see I've already issued everything I need for my phase 2. If I just do a quick sort by release name, my phase 2 is already issued into production. So I'm going to take a look at that in production console. So I'm going to go down to production, and open up Production Console. So within Production Console, I'm already pre-filtered for my mark work orders, and I've got my contract active as well in my filters. So the first piece of new functionality we can see in the console interface is, like we saw at lotting, nesting and ordering, generate work orders, our detailed list, and of course in production control, we've got the option here for displaying individual marker mark item instances and enabling our cancelled marker mark item instances to the grid as well. So we can see here we've already got a partial black flag visible. So the team on the shop floor can see what's going on in terms of when marks or mark items have indeed been black flagged and cancelled. We also have a new piece of functionality in here surrounding the way in which we can view our mark statuses. Now this is something that's reflected again back through the system, but if I come up here and go to view mark status, as I say, I've highlighted up this W section in the background. If I expand this out, so with our mark item view expanded, we have some new columns enabled inside this view, indicating the workstation and the facility that the mark items are designated to and being processed on. So we can see here we've got several component parts at the cutting stage at those various workstations at that facility. So that's going to allow us to identify and track where our mark items for this mark are being fabricated. So if I change this out to my mark item view, we can see we've got some new columns enabled in this view as well for 10.4. We've now got the stock bar length column coming through, and we now have received from mark as well. Now the received from mark and the stock bar length, those fields have been enabled to try and reduce down the amount of printing of reports that's required. For example, the stock bar list used to require the cutting list report being printed to be able to see the data for that. Now we can see it directly on grid. Same for the received from mark. That's again going to reduce down the amount of print work that's required to hand data to the guys on the machinery to get the data that they require. So we also have enabled in the grids our column for the nesting engine used. So that's going to allow the operator to select the correct materials for a specific sheet or certain task. So that's been exposed in the grids for that specific reason. We also have our new icon in the margin. We can see here we've got one there, broken out as a new status for a line in both production control and production console. So the idea is that when material has been ordered but not yet fully received, instead of us having a pair of scissors on the line like we used to in the old system, we now have this new unique icon that indicates that that is the current state of the awaited material. So we also have our options in console. If I select a few of my items here, to go to print drawings, and now we can batch print drawings as we saw on our previous webinar, available on YouTube, to do with drawing controls through the system. So if we have a look here, we've got the option to print simply just the mark item drawings. As we're in the mark item view, we can look at the mark drawings connected to these mark items, or we can use print both. Now there are two options here. The first one, printing work pack with all mark items per mark. Every time it sees an instance of a mark item, it will create that drawing for it. Or the alternative, where you get one drawing because it's seen multiple quantities of that mark item. So if I was to go to that function, it would then generate the work pack for me in PDF form. So for our next step, I'm just going to specify an employee. So we'll put Chris on for that. And I'm just going to grab a few of these lines and hit start. We're going to generate a quick timesheet from those. So they've now moved into currently active. I'm just going to grab all of them. So I'm just going to stop those and hit OK. That also brings me to the next point, where in 10.4 we now have only one cutting option when it comes down to entering our cutting information. The additional field that we had available for entering specified offcuts is no longer available, as this is the preferred method for us with more options to conclude each of our cuts. So now that I've completed that process, I should now have, if I refresh my contract, some timesheets. So if I just drop into the timesheets quickly, we now have a new option in 10.4 where we can go into our timesheets and we can now use the batch update to update everything from cost code right the way through to the approval state. So we can specify approved, which would make them ready then for export. So just to finish off, we're going to take a look at building our budget for our contract and also take a look at the material traceability report. So first of all, I'm going to go back to contracts management and create a new budget. Make sure I specify my contract, and I'm going to set this to no breakdown as well. Save that. I'm going to go to actions. I'm going to add my cost code figures in from my estimate. I'm just going to grab everything and add all of that in. There may be some zero values in the budgeted values. However, there may be at some point throughout the job a value that comes through on actuals that may indeed account for something that I didn't budget for. So I'm going to leave those in there. Now, a new option for 10.4 is the ability under Actions to go to Export all grids to Excel. Now, by doing this, it's going to create me an Excel workbook that's going to allow me to see each of these tabs in a different book. So if I go Export, we can see it's exported my grid views out into multiple workbooks within the same file. And to finish off, we're going to take a look at our material traceability report. As I have some cut items, I'm going to go to my contracts report, go to production, and I'm going to run my material traceability report. So I'm going to run the report for my phase 2, and I'm also going to include my test certificates to see our new enhancements in 10.4. So if I run that report, we can see now in 10.4 we've incorporated the document ID into the fields associated with each of the mark items on the report. Now that's going to allow us to identify which of the test certificates published at the bottom of the report is connected to the relative mark item. So that way it'll order itself by the ID, and the ID itself can be used to identify, as I say, which certificate is associated to which mark item. Throughout the course of this webinar, we've covered a great many new features and enhancements for STRUMIS version 10.4. However, there are still many more that we have included in this release. For a full list of enhancements, please refer to the What's New guide. Thank you for participating in this 10.4 webinar. For those of you who had questions posted in the chat window, we're now going to do a quick Q&A session with Chris Eaton.